Well, it looks like we've mostly arrived, so I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming on a rainy night. We're very lucky to have Karen Cook with us tonight. We've been aiming to have KPF increasingly involved again with the AA, partly because it's an office that is so successful actually realizing projects, which is a nice thing. So after a few lectures where we've seen endless numbers of speculative projects that will be either unbuildable or unbuilt, it's really very nice to go into some detail and to have the opportunity to really reflect in depth on just a few projects that are very clearly speaking to the great range of issues that affect tall buildings and urbanism together. So we're very lucky in that respect to have Karen Cook come and speak to us tonight. Karen is someone who is known to some of our faculty members here at the AA. I understand that she studied with Charles Tashima at the GSD. She joined KPF in 1984 and helped to launch the London office in 1989. She is now a principal with KPF and is responsible for a number of their more successful projects in recent years. She was responsible for their master plan for River City in Prague and as well for the flagship office building, the Danube House of that is part of that project. She has been also in charge of a competition-winning entry, which we'll hear more about tonight, for the transformation of an existing tower in La Défense. In many ways, a project that is, of course, more difficult than designing a building from scratch. And she's also in charge of the current work on Bishopsgate Tower in London, and she'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the projects that KPF is involved with here in London. In a way, this is also part of what makes this conjuncture so important, in that we are, for the first time in a very long time, in a position in London where we can really speak about quality architecture in relationship to the development of the city. It's been a long time, I think, since we've really had architects at the forefront of thinking about how the city will develop and actually seeing many of these projects realized. And so it's very nice, again, to have Karen here to talk about the range of issues from their environmental sustainability to the technical challenges and to the aspects of the planning of urban public space that we would link as well to the planning of tall buildings. And that all of these things together are what make the topic so very exciting for us. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Karen Cook for us tonight. Thank you.
So thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me. I have to apologize actually because the buildings aren't built yet, and I do think as a practitioner I should be showing built work. However, the current phenomenon in London of planning and debating tall buildings is something that's never happened before, and I think it's worth discussing a little bit tonight. Why tall buildings is maybe the first question, and that question is easily asked by people around the world, maybe more differently in London. The world is getting more crowded, more resources are required, and every time you are struggling for land use, you have conflict. We have world population expansion, which is happening a lot more rapidly in developing countries than in Europe, but it's nevertheless happening here as well. And more people are moving to the city, which means that the cities have to cope with growth of their own through either immigration or people migrating from rural areas into the city. London, like many other North American and European cities, occupies too much of its fair share of the earth, and that yellow dashed line across the bottom represents where we ought to be if we want to preserve and conserve the earth for future generations. it's a simple mathematical exercise to talk about building taller in order to save land. And I think when we talk about density, cities like Berlin, which has a very prescribed zoning density, are talking about building 3 to 4 times the plot area or the site area, while tall buildings can range anywhere from 16 to 20, or in the case of the buildings we're doing in London, 28 times the site ratio, site area. So, as I said, increasingly people are moving to our cities, and we have to find ways of making our cities interesting places to live, and that the quality that we bring is not just about more space. And this image shows our work around the globe. On the left side, we have tall buildings under construction or built already in Asia. The middle slide is North America, and the slide on the right is represents the work we've built in Europe or are planning in Europe. You can see this scale comparison, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. To bring us to the London context, and what about doing a tall building in London, which is different than doing a tall building in another city, especially in a city in Asia, where we're building most of the tall buildings in the world today. London, until now, hasn't really had tall buildings, and the monuments that you see in the foreground and the city and the river, and especially the monument of St. Paul's in the background, have more or less dictated the heights of the other buildings. When we did come to Europe in the late 1980s, some of our first projects were high-rise buildings, and they fortunately funded us through the major recession, which you're probably all too young to remember. We wouldn't be here today if it weren't for those buildings. And these buildings actually were very site-specific, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but this was won as a competition primarily because we integrated housing into the base and created small-scale structures at the base, and that was something that was not really being done in other buildings. Why tall buildings in London has really nothing to do with wanting to make better use of the land. The City of London is competing commercially with Canary Wharf, and you could say that London has always been shaped by market forces, and that's still the fact today. Large companies, which are growing ever bigger and want ever cheaper office space, are looking at Canary Wharf, and it's become very successful. And on the other hand, in terms of quality of life, the city is competing with the West End, where you have much more entertaining nightlife or just more vibrant place to work and live. London has grown in a manner of swallowing up other centres or other towns, and still today functions that way in a governmental way and in a planning policy way, which makes it difficult to create a unified planning policy. And each node is competing for growth as well. Today, the debate of tall buildings is happening in nodes other than the city, but we're going to concentrate on the city itself right now. The square mile, which is the financial and insurance district, has already had tall buildings, and in the last 20 years has had quite a lot of development. The red zones represent sites that have either been rebuilt in the last 20 years or have gained planning consent to be rebuilt. So you can see it's a very dynamic place. It's not the museum that people would maybe like to think it is. The blue buildings represent existing tall buildings, and by that I mean tall comparative to the buildings that are already there, so maybe 20-story buildings and above. There's actually quite a lot of them, and they are grouped together near public transport, and also, you'll see in a moment, out of the constraints of the urban planning. The red dots are our sites for DIFA, which is called the Bishopsgate Tower, and for the Heron Tower. We try to, the sites happen to be located near good transport. That wasn't our choice, but that's why the city works and why we think it's good to continue to promote tall buildings there. This image shows an overlay of constraints that are suggested in the urban planning, the UDP, and the white areas are where you're relatively free of constraint, and London's zoning is unlike the prescriptive zoning of a city like Chicago or New York or Berlin, where there's quite a lot dictated about the site. In London, it's all about negotiation and discussion, and there's a lot of debate. And it means that it takes a long time. It's very expensive for the clients to do that. It means there's a lot of debate among different groups with different agendas, with different goals. And the architect's job really has to be to try to bring those people together and make a situation that everybody feels comfortable with, hopefully. St. Paul's and Westminster happen to be the only really height controlling factors of the planning. And these images show radially views that have been agreed by governmental bodies that need to be preserved or protected from those two monuments. It has led to some kind of pancake areas of the city, which are also not very satisfactory if you're looking at the urban design of your city, because it does indeed preserve those views, but it doesn't create other skylines of any interest, low or tall. The red area in this slide are areas on the ground from where you can currently see St. Paul's around the monument. This figure ground plan shows the street pattern today of the City of London, which is no explicable order until you start to find centers that were formerly either marketplaces or public monuments linked together. This has always grown this way. It's not unique to London. It's the similar situation in most of Britain's cities. It means that when you look at designing a building, you're not looking at it. It means when you're designing a building, you're looking at it from sort of a perspectival approach to townscape. You're looking at the building from unexpected vantage points that open up as you move through the city. The Bishopsgate Tower on the left and the Heron Tower on the right, we tried to compose in such a way in adding into the townscape. The two are both meant to be seen in the round, perhaps the Bishopsgate Tower a bit more than the Heron Tower. Here you see them on the bottom right-hand side of the slide in comparison to some of the other tall buildings in the world. The building on the upper left is our building in Shanghai, here shown with the round aperture, now has been changed to make the Chinese more comfortable that the Japanese flag is not staring them in the face. The site for the Heron Tower, this shows some of the Roman aspects of the city, and the site for the Heron Tower is located at what was known once upon a time as Bishopsgate. Nowadays, the site is a little bit less historically recognizable. It's nevertheless important in terms of the very same routes that pass through the city. And we will be replacing this tall building you see on the left, which is currently on a traffic island. Up until now, or up until a couple of years ago, London's tall buildings consisted really of NatWest, or now Tower 42, and it functioned as a solitaire in the city. Whether or not it deserved to be such is a different debate, but that's how it functioned. And once the bomb created a site for Swiss Re, and a second tower was built at exactly the same height, 183 meters, you start to get a dialogue happening, and they're actually quite close together within the city, and they speak to each other. And all of a sudden you don't have a solitaire, although the Gherkin is a very iconographic type building, you still have this dialogue happening between the two buildings. And adding a third tower, also at the time exactly 183 meters, starts to create this little family of buildings which the city planners call the emerging cluster. And there are now other buildings participating in that as well. This is the Heron Tower at nighttime, the core located to the south. This is looking up Bishopsgate then. The view from Waterloo Bridge, again, Heron Tower being sort of in a cluster with NatWest and the Gherkin. The Bishopsgate site which is, over time has been many different things, including a mansion which is now transported to Chelsea, has always had a route through the site, and is you would never guess that by looking at this building, which is currently on the site, but there is a route through it. You have to fight the security guard if you want to go through. We started this building not knowing how tall it would end up being. The client did not ask us to make the tallest building. In fact, they asked us not to make the tallest building because they wanted to avoid undue attention and debate. The city planner, Peter Rees, who's a very engaging speaker, if you ever have a chance to hear him, wanted the building to be 183 meters because at that time they thought that all the buildings in the city should be exactly the same height. And we were concerned that that would create sort of a wall effect if you got very far along down the line, and furthermore it doesn't allow the city to be dynamic, that over time it would never be possible to really have a city that was all the same height at that height, and that it would be better to be able to always add a building at a different height as long as it created a compositional balance with its neighbors that at that point in time would make sense. So we started with that approach in mind, and Minerva sort of dragged the center of gravity away. I think that is taking care of itself now, but it's probably not going to happen, unfortunately, or not. And Richard Rogers' building for British Land brought the tightness of the cluster back to the center, leaving sort of a gap, which you'll see in another image more clearly, for the site that we are working on. And because that was in the center, people started urging that it become the taller object. This is the taller height. In fact, it's been reduced a little bit since this time. The spot in the middle underneath the red roof is where the Bishopsgate Tower will go, and it's the intention now of the city planner to create sort of a crescendo effect, that you would have kind of foothills of buildings of 20 or 30 stories and then rising up to something in the center, which is not to say that something taller or something else along the side won't come, but they think it's very important to create this image, kind of maybe like Boston has when you're coming down from the north and you come around the corner and then all of a sudden you see all the buildings together from that particular viewpoint clustered together, and it makes a very powerful group. It also means that you no longer have a solitaire condition, but you have a group of buildings which read together as a group, and not to be in competition with St. Paul's, which the city planners still respect should be the monument of the city. The brief from the client to us was actually quite straightforward and not very prescriptive. Well, or very, depending on your point of view. The public realm at the bottom of the building was a mandate, partly from the client's viewpoint, but certainly from the city's viewpoint. The client wanted large commercial floor plates at the bottom, varying to smaller ones so they could offer some variety, and also the possibility of some public realm at the top of the building. We started studying a site which is very, very awkward in shape. It's sort of a C shape. It's not at all stable for a tall building if you build a skinny, narrow building, and it's a bit strange to build a C-shaped building. The first form just shows what you would do if you put a lump of area on the site and extruded the site upward, and the following images show exactly the same quantum of space but in different forms, because we were really stuck. The site is about 100 meters long and 20 meters wide, and how would we find a form that fit on that site, which is quite crammed in. And these show just different attempts, almost systematically, without really considering form from the origin of form, but form from the origin of what have we to start working with. And what we found was that on one hand, the proximity to Richard Rogers' building was so close that it wouldn't really work to put a tall building at the southern portion of the site. We needed to push it to the north to get it to have some kind of gap, and also to be able to see through to Swiss Re. We tried to figure out a way to hold it up if we could make it that slender, and we also looked at starting to divide the floor into 2 zones because the client wanted to be able to lease to 2 different tenants per floor. We started cutting away at the building, trying to see if we could relate the height of the building to other heights as we would cut it, and also to push it to the north to get it out of the view of Fleet Street, which is the Queen's processional route to St. Paul's. Was very important. It had the power to stop another project. So again, the area to the north. What we then realized we needed to do was turn it around sideways so that if there were 2 tenants per floor, everyone could enjoy good views of the river and not be stuck looking backwards into the side of the building. And we needed to give it some stability so that it didn't fall over, so it started kicking out at the back on the lower floors. And then we cut it on the northwestern corner so that we could bring some light into the Norman church around the back. And finally we ended up with a form that was just cut to pieces and didn't really have much sense in any way whatsoever in terms of form. So we just decided that if we would wrap it together, that the wrapper would give it some continuity and fluidity. And if we still try to stick with the ideas that I think the next one will show. The building is cut in such a way that the top cuts relate to the neighboring tall buildings which will be around it, which doesn't really make sense if those other tall buildings aren't there. This shows the animation that we had to make for English Heritage to prove that you couldn't see the building coming down Fleet Street, and this was a big issue for them. So as you enter Fleet Street, you don't see the building at all. Then you do reach a point where it comes into full view, which is fine for them as long as you don't also see St. Paul's at the same time. And then there's about 50 meters where you do see them both together. And then we decided to make an animation because they were getting really hung up on a still image. And the one still image was only representing a fraction of the experience of the street, which is experienced in a transitory manner. And from St. Paul's, you actually see that the cluster is still quite far away and doesn't really play a role in the immediate context of St. Paul, certainly as a pedestrian within the city. So here you see as well, perhaps more clearly, the way the top of the building is cut away to relate to other neighboring buildings. And I'm going to skip the rest of this because there's another video after this one. Okay, the building from St. Paul's. The plan of the building is very unusual for an office building. Most of our clients want a rectangle, which didn't fit on this site whatsoever. And nevertheless, we managed to get some straight zones around the sides. It's basically, a series of flat planes connected by cones at the corner which permit the building to taper. And I think Lars Hesselgren might have given a lecture here about the geometry of how that works, and if you ever want to see that again, we can organize that. It's a whole nother topic. We couldn't be drawing this building without the computer, but it's important to say that the design wasn't generated because of the computer. The design was generated, and then the computer is used to master the geometry, which is quite complex. Because the building tapers, and on some faces also is curved inward or outward, and yet you have to work with repetitive building components. If you were drawing by hand, I think no one would have the patience to sit through the whole thing. The structure is also driven by computer optimization series, and we do have a perimeter tube structure. We started out with diagonal bracing everywhere, which is the best way to get the beams down to a smaller size. But we didn't want the architectural image of bracing everywhere, like some of the other buildings. It would be too similar. With the computer generation today, they're able to assess where you actually need the structure and where you don't, and you can start eliminating elements and just put them where you need them, and it generates unexpected patterns. From left to right, you see the progression to more of a basket weave, or as if the basket was woven and then unwoven. or the columns themselves are all equidistant on any floor, but they slope upward and are independent of the movement of the cladding, which is on the office planning module. The cladding that we're using on the project is a double skin, which is the best way today to meet the current energy requirements. We also made great advantage of it due to the curvilinear form of the building, because the idea of keeping flat panels but negotiating the corners was very important in making a deliberate appearance of the snakeskin. So by going around the corner with flat panels that are overlapping, we create the texture that we want, and hopefully a sort of shimmering effect, and bring in air that is taken either directly into the office by opening the window, or back to the core to turn it into fresh air for the office floor. And those have been extensively studied with Hilson Moran to make sure that the pressures are correct on the outside of the facade. It can't be done in certain wind conditions. And also bringing sufficient daylight into the space, which allows us to turn off the electricity supply for the lighting. It's very important in achieving the BREEAM rating, and also trying to meet the mayor's energy targets, which he's also introduced in addition to the European and British legislation, to try to reduce the carbon footprint of the building. If we come back to the public realm for a minute, one of the examples that was referred to not by us initially, but by the people in London as a successful urban space is Rockefeller Center. And it's interesting to note that in America, if you talk to people about Rockefeller Center, they don't really know what the building looks like that's associated with it. It's the space which is important, and the things that go on there. And in the city of London, perhaps Broadgate by SOM is a very successful example of a place where people can enjoy themselves. Nothing particularly special there, but a good space that's protected from traffic, that has sun exposure, and people can easily walk there quickly from their office at lunchtime. So what the city is hoping to achieve is connecting a series of existing spaces with new spaces that make the city a more walkable place. And we hope that our projects can try to connect into that archipelago of spaces and reinforce even with the public spaces. It's important to go back to the idea of what a tall building can do for the city, not just on the skyline, but at the ground level. There's a significant budget set aside for building the building, and the city has figured out that they should make the client contribute something. NatWest, when it was built, was a sort of typical 60s and 70s approach to just having a figure in a plaza. 1991 brought the IRA bomb, which made the potential to redo the building and redo the space in front of the building. And in fact, they took away the space and put it as an inside space. But in doing so, they created a more typical City of London typology of medieval street, which was not so windswept. They shoehorned in a very nice little restaurant, and it's actually functioning much better in the city than it did before. Swiss Re, again, a very unusual typology for London, a building in the center of a square. It's not the norm in London, and that has become now, thanks to the warm summers, a very successful summer space. The Heron Tower project is closing a street to create a pedestrian space adjacent to its site, because the site is so small, which works very well in front of the church. Currently it's an island site with the traffic going around it, and that area is being closed and pedestrianized, which gives a frame for the church and also allows the internal public space to spill out onto that space. And also on the upper right, you see with the idea of linking Devonshire Square with Finsbury Circus through the site just makes crossing that traffic island a little bit more pleasant. There's also public space dragged up into the top of the building with a sky bar, which in a city where there aren't very many tall buildings yet, even the 37th story seems exciting. Richard Rogers Building at the bottom is going to contribute a very large public space, so you start to see the spaces being stitched together. And the site that we're working on for DIFA also has the potential to knit together a series of spaces which are starting to emerge. We're going to open the site again publicly, permanently underneath the building, which will connect Bank Tube Station through Threadneedle Street, through our site, onto Swiss Re. And so you see actually very disparate spaces around the building, Bishopsgate being very busy, the plaza behind Indo-Suez House being very vast. There's a Norman churchyard. That route through will start to link those together, and then each one of those spaces will have a stronger relationship to each other, we hope. So the idea being that all of the ground level to the north of the site is accessible for public functions, and at the bottom part of the site, the darker brown level becomes the private office entrance. We very much wanted to express the structure at the bottom of the building as part of that way through, initially partly due to the archaeology which is under the site, which prevents the superstructure from coming down, and also using the skin of the building to pull away and create and mark the entry space, much like the robes of the Piero della Francesca paintings, and also creating a protective zone for people to bring the scale of the building hopefully down to a more pedestrian scale, and manipulate it, either lifting it up to mark an entrance or pulling it down to protect people from the wind. And we actually went through about 80 wind tunnel tests, I think, to arrive at the particular shape at the moment, which is looking like this, and where the scales of the skin above are turned as well to control the direction of the wind. That's what it looks like from the east side, and you see the route through the building to the street beyond. We were able to provide so much public space at the bottom of the building because due to a clever lifting strategy, which is being used in other tall buildings in the world, but not yet here, which is blue representing express shuttles, which take people up to sky lobbies, and there they change to a local elevator. So all of those local elevators don't have to go to the ground. If you have been in a tall building in New York, for example, you have banks and banks of maybe 24 or 30 elevators, and in this site there would be simply no space left for anything else. It also allows us to drag the public street of the building vertically, and make social spaces out of those transfer levels, and offer either social spaces for people working in the building or publicly accessible spaces. And now we're moving that top one to the very top of the building, which you see here. And the brown part of the building is also photovoltaic cells, which are the top cladding panels and generate enough power for the top 3 floors of the building. One of the tools that we use the computer for as well is to generate a series of perspectives walking through the street, which you can see primarily to show the city planners and English heritage as well, how the building fits into the townscape role, and how it actually, because of the type of street pattern in London, it looks quite different from each side. So how do you recognize it as the same building? And this view is the latest rendering coming from Bank, and you see the route through the building underneath, as well as escalators taking you up to the express lifts, which are entered on the upper first and second floor levels. So that's the Bishopsgate Tower, and I think that, yes, this is a fly-through. If I can start it. Yeah. So this shows the St. Paul's height restrictions, which are blanketing the city, but the cluster sort of escapes that, and that's why there's the possibility of tall buildings there at all. And this is a bit slow. The square mile is represented by the brighter color. And I don't know if you can find where the future sites are within the cluster. again, NatWest, Swiss Re, Heron, 122 Leadenhall, and the Bishopsgate Tower. So, and Willis, which is actually the first one now, topped out if you have looked at the city recently. I'll just go on. I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about La Défense as well, which is a totally different kind of urban context, or perhaps you would hesitate to call it urban in contrast to London. This building is in a similar phase as the Bishopsgate Tower project, although the contractor has been appointed. We're a little bit further along in the development of the work. The building that we're working on was built in 1974, and it's currently reached the end of its useful life, and that means that the mechanical system is outdated. It doesn't work very well anymore. The facade is leaking, and no one wants to be in the building because it's not very nice. And the client asked us to look at what we could do to improve the quality of the building internally, as well as improve the expression of the building, which they found to be not very attractive. It's the brown building which says AXA on the top. So it happens to be one of the buildings at La Défense, which is also quite visible from the city of Paris, and that engaged us in another debate as well. And if you'll notice, the La Défense skyline at the moment is relatively, well, it's created by buildings with relatively flat tops, which I was told by the Ministry of Culture that's a French phenomenon, but we tried to explain to them it was really more about the 70s. The local authority created this image a year ago, after we did the competition, in fact, because they wanted to show the world that Paris is also going to become a modern city. And for them, it was very much about the image then. And I'm not sure if they consider this to be a French image or a globally competing image. They're in their mind, they are competing with London, they're competing with Frankfurt, and they want to attract big companies to come to their city. They also want to make sure that people like working there, and so their debate is not just about the size of the building, but also about the public realm. And the commercial aspect of it is that by increasing the quantity of space, they also increase their tax revenue, so that they have the money to pay for improving the public realm. By the way, the axis represents the center of the universe. This is the building, which is visible from many different sides, and the pinwheel form arose at the time it was built when none of the other buildings around it existed, and it made sense, perhaps architecturally, to have the pinwheel form. And the tripartite form happened because there were 3 insurance companies coming together to make one building, and somebody thought that would be a clever way of recognizing that. This image shows the approach on the metro across the Seine. As you get out of the metro, what do you see? And as you approach from the other metro station at the other end of the Grand Esplanade, what do you see? The local authority also obliged us, as part of the competition, to blast away part of the building at the bottom, because they felt it was important to improve the route through. The green circulation represents the only link, which is a raised bridge across a highway to the entire district of that part of La Défense, which is comprised of office buildings as well as residential buildings. If you've been to La Défense, you'll know that it's created out of a real ground level and a fake ground level. And this was, again, sort of the Hugh Ferris idea that all of the transport and cars should be suppressed, and that you would have this utopian plaza, which would be just for pedestrians. And in fact, what it creates is a very dead and unreal kind of place. This is an axonometric of the building as it exists today, and you can see that what we propose to do is to start taking area away in some areas, to the red on the right bottom being where we have to take area away to allow people to pass through the building, the blue being where we could add area back to give a more dynamic character or to create something happening at the ground level. So basically, our idea about the skyline change was simple. We took each of the three wings and change the height. So one wing stayed the same, one wing went down, and one wing went up. And then we also changed the angle to make it more spiraling and more dynamic. We did quite a lot of work proposal for the interior as well, partly based on the idea that if we actually took area away from the interior, we could, in doing so, create more interesting spaces where people working today could have breakout spaces or meeting areas or reception areas. And these are other images of, well, on the upper left, a building we've built in London showing how a bank headquarters now works well with their own breakout space. The building on the lower left in Prague, where we've created a terrace area and garden inside the building. They liked that idea a lot, although we had 36 three-story versions at the time, and we used that to try to make the building appear more slender. We've reduced the number, but we still have about 8 of them in the building, so we're still happy with that. These images are basically part of the building regulations that we have to work with when we try to come up with an image for the cladding for the facade, which would be nice not to have them, but they're there, and they're there for health and safety reasons. They're there for environmental reasons. This shows the fire code regulations where we have to have fire-rated zones on the facade, so between floors, basically, or between wings. This shows where we need extra special acoustic protection against the highway and where the facade has to work harder to keep the sound out of the building so that people can enjoy a quiet atmosphere to work in. We also take a look at the solar factor, meaning where is the building suffering the most from too much sun exposure in this summer season versus the winter season, which are different because of the different angle of the sun, of course. And we try to respond to that in coming up with a strategy for how we would put a skin on the building. And because the building is so wide, we really wanted to break up the volume in putting the protective shield only where it was really needed and use it to create an image for the building at the same time. So we wrapped it around the building and then cut it away where it wasn't needed, and the sort of shadow outline you see here is where where the skin of the bouclier or shield is placed. So the building today looks like that, and our proposal is that it would change quite a lot by the different heights and the different skins. And again, a bit closer, and again from the other side. So our intention is that it doesn't look exactly the same from each side, but we think it's still obviously the same building, but we play with the composition to try to break down the gigantic form of the building and give it some movement as well. So we think actually that in changing the form, we've become a little bit truer to the original concept of the pinwheel. From a distance, it's more legible as a pinwheel. From a close-up, well, sorry, I'll come back to the public realm in a bit. These represent more exploratory, perhaps more decorative aspects of our work, where the skin of the building, which is going past the roof, which is creating a crown on the building, we're simply taking the folded metal skin of the building and pulling it past the roof. It needs to be perforated to allow wind to pass through, and it needs to be easy to build and inexpensive. So we're looking at folded metal sheets. That then we take that effect of the folded metal sheet right down the face of the building, which again gives it a bit more dynamic reading, hopefully, and exaggerates the difference between the smooth skin of the bouclier and the more textured skin of the folded metal panels. Some attempts to figure out how that will actually work, and we're still exploring those aspects. And then the very tip of the building, where we're protecting some electro-generator shaft ventilation, we try to use to sort of create a crowning effect and pull the height of the building up in a more elongated way. So if we go back to the base of the building, where we're doing something totally different than what we're doing at the top of the building, and there's a totally different design problem. As I said, the pinwheel shape doesn't integrate very well into now the orthogonal context around the building. the local authority obliging us to punch away part of the base of the building to allow a wider passageway through the building. This is the current condition around the building. I suppose you could say it's achieved maybe somebody's original intention with the greenery and the cars on another level and the pedestrians on their level, but the building itself doesn't really engage in the public realm at all. It's a very blind facade, literally no entrance as you approach from the subway, and no clue as to what the activity inside might be. This is the square to the north of the building, which is used by a lot of residents on the weekend. And this is the side facing the highway. So our intention then, our proposal, if the existing building is on the left, was to bring some of the public functions or social functions which exist today in the base of the building, in the basement levels, to bring them up to the ground level, which meant, again, cutting through some slabs and rebuilding some parts. And that allows us to use those small volumes to create a better urban form, as well as a more penetrable, permeable, accessible building. That was the idea of the gardens as well. This is a section through the building showing that we would bring people in at both levels, not just at the upper level, and that open up that lobby so that it was quite large, and even the lobby would be visible on the bridge at the side. And the eating space at the back would also be, well, there are eating spaces all around the building. In fact, there are seats for 4,000 people, but the space to the north is a restaurant which the public could share. And these show the explorations of that form wrapping around the building, and basically a building in its own right, creating scale which is accessible to the public. This shows the existing condition to the north on that plaza, and the idea of creating a volume at the bottom which simply brings the scale down and creates an orthogonal shape so that it feels that it fits in, and then the idea that eventually they could use the money from the tax, from the extra space, to redo that square. The form on the south side of the building, actually, because it's facing the boulevard, the highway, which they call a boulevard, could be more dynamic, could be more of its own shape rather than trying to blend in, because there isn't a context of buildings there, while the building on the north side is more of a discrete volume. And this shows trying to bring activity into the base of the building. And what we have today is on the right-hand side, an outdoor space under a flat roof, which is announcing the arrival. We're building a new bridge, which is much wider, to create a new entrance for the building and a more appropriately scaled route to the other spaces. The pavilion to the north is broken in height, but not in elevation, to create, again, try to break down the scale to a pedestrian scale. And then the volume on the south side is still fluid, but not round as it was before. So that's where we might be heading, and that's taking us back out. Then these are the people in our office that are currently working on those projects or have contributed a lot to the generation of the project. There are a lot of other people as well, but these are the people who have contributed the most of their time. The people highlighted are the people who attended school here, so and actually have contributed significantly to those projects, and many of them are here tonight, which I appreciate too. So that's it.
Well, we have some time for questions, and I would like to thank Heron for a very informative and very wide-ranging discussion of these projects. While you're thinking about your questions to ask, Karen, I have one. And one of the things that I'm struck by in looking at the way in which you have approached the projects is the breadth of issues that you're bringing to bear on each of these tower projects. And one of the things that seems to have become possible with the changing use of geometry, that is, it's not so much that it's at the start of the idea, but it is in a way responsive to multiple conditions, somehow has freed you to begin to think about many more aspects of the way in which a tower will engage with the city. At the same time, it seems like planners are still kind of stuck with nothing more than the image and the circulation around the ground. Are you starting to get a sense that this may change, or that, in a way, architecture is opening up a new domain of discussion for planners in relation to what tall buildings can do and how they ought to be approaching the planning of centers and nodes within the cities?
I think some planners are more open or learning faster than others. And certainly in the City of London, you can see that there's been quite a strong response to that. I'm not sure well, certainly in the sense of the word of tool, they've pounced on the fact that we can show them more accurate information. I think sometimes they get a little bit obsessed with the accuracy and less with the qualitative side of it. And also there's a danger and it happened when we were talking on the DIFA project. We carried more than one option of a massing form for quite a while. And there was a debate about whether buildings in the city should be simple forms or whether they should be more complex forms. In New York, for example, there are some very beautiful buildings which are very simple buildings. And those buildings, in order to be nice, require a great deal of sophistication in the way that they're built. They require a very high budget, and they also require a large body of buildings in which to fit into. In other words, the image of the city isn't relying on that simple building to create the image of the city. If you look back historically at New York, the first buildings that were built that were very tall, like the Woolworth Building or the Chrysler Building, were very beautiful buildings on the skyline as well. And the City of London really wants buildings that create an image for the city. And perhaps after several buildings are built, they will understand that it's also possible to have simple buildings that are nice, that can contribute quite a lot, both in the fabric of the city from afar as well as up close. I'm not sure that, we'll see if the use of the computer brings other ways of looking at buildings. I think as I said, they've helped us explore the building structurally, mechanically, climate-wise, as well as geometry-wise. And I think those essays are actually having a more profound impact on what's happening in a building than the form is, although the form is what you see. The work that's going on behind the scenes is actually going to have a more profound impact. And as well in the construction industry, because today, thankfully, a lot of the contractors, well, every contractor that's going to stay competitive is using computers as well, which, I mean, they still look for repetitive form and geometrically controlled form. So that's important to remember, but they're certainly more open to more complexity than they ever were before. It doesn't necessarily mean a cost increase to the project. So I don't know if that was an answer to your question or not. But
other questions?
there seems to be a certain level of complexity when you're dealing with the ground floor and how the building is dealing with the street and the edge of the street. So how the building is meeting the ground floor, and you're trying to deal with the public realm in a certain level of complexity. But when you talked about the body of the building, you talked about the sky lobbies, and you stopped there. Is there another level of complexity that you can deal with inside the building? Because when you're talking about vertical cities, it seemed to me like all what you're talking about is the relationship with the ground floor, but it stopped there. All what we have is stacking, then sky lobbies.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question, and in order to answer it, I would need to start talking about our work elsewhere. Mixed-use projects which are being built in Asia and in the Middle East, where there is much more complexity going on vertically in terms of large chunks of programmatic function, tend to require much larger buildings in order for them to be economical. There is going to be Renzo Piano's Shard here, which will have hotel and office and residential built within a similar height, but it's actually terribly financially ineffective unless you have a much bigger building to work with, because of the elevator systems and the mechanical systems, which once you build them for a large chunk of building, you need to build a bit more for them to be efficient. And the other thing that can be factored into that is energy sharing between the different functions, because the heat generated by the offices, which the offices need to shed, so people, computers, electricity, can be transferred to heat that the residential actually wants, or generating power to be shared by others, and that can work in a single building. The Mayor of London wants that to start happening across the city so that you don't actually have to put everything into one building. I think there's a question as well as, and maybe farther into the future when we really do have to have a lot of tall buildings close together and people live and work in the same building. I'm not sure that's a good idea. I have a friend from childhood who grew up and became an accountant, worked in Detroit in a tall building and lived on one floor and worked on another floor. He's now divorced and quit his job. So I don't know if I'm not saying that it has to be that model. I think that one of the exciting things about being in a city is going outside, and that the important thing about vibrancy is that you do have people living where they're working, and that you do have, the people living there will generate other types of restaurants or leisure activities that make the office area a vibrant place to be, and the only way it's vibrant is if people go out. So, yes, apart from the sky lobbies, the rest of the building is very repetitive, and we did have some multi-story spaces inside at the very beginning that the client wasn't interested in entertaining. We believe, though, that if a tenant were to come and take several floors, they might be very likely to knock holes in their floor to create those kinds of spaces, because their tenants, their employees actually work better when they have that interconnectivity and places to gather. So the building is flexible in that regard if that's a desire later on, but that's a good question.
So. Zooming out a bit to the sort of the urban scale, as you know, in London there's been quite strong reactions sort of for and against the mayor's sort of wish to push towards this sort of image of more towers. And could you reflect a bit on when does a cluster become a cluster? It's a very tricky issue. Obviously, you're dealing with a single client with a single site, and they want to maximise that site. And you're making arguments to the planners about how that becomes part of a much larger urban scale of imagining a new sort of form and shape. Very difficult to argue those points sort of on a sort of factual or scientific basis, whereas much of the other work you do is extremely specific around the actual performance of the building and the space use of the building itself. But at that level of the urban formation, do you get involved in quite detailed sort of arguments and discussions to sort of justify one position or another? It's obviously different in Paris than it is in London or in Shanghai.
It's very different in every city. London, as you know, doesn't have a unified zoning policy, which makes it even more difficult. The City of London has a very successful policy within its own area, and I think has handled it very well. And the City of Frankfurt, for example, has decided you will build tall buildings here, and they actually actively seek clients to try to get them to build them there. And Paris as well has a very defined strategy, which is involving the government at the highest levels, meaning the president and the Ministry of the Interior, to define exactly how much space they're going to build and exactly what it means for transport and exactly how much it means for tax. London, well, Britain has a different kind of government, which is really why I think it's different. It's my own personal theory, maybe. There's a law which is based on precedent, but each time you do something, it's negotiated again. And the site, well, it's also a very, very capitalist approach, I suppose, where each person it's up for grabs what he can try to prove that he wants or fits into the city. That keeps a lot of people out of the discussion because it's very expensive for a client to embark on this procedure having no idea what his result is going to be, whether he could build another 6-story building on this site that he's maybe paid too much money for, or whether he's going to end up building the tallest building. He really doesn't know. And he doesn't know if that's going to be an answer in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. And even then, whether somebody wants to build it. So I think it's interesting because you end up with, I think, a very dynamic city. If you look at London over time, it's always been that way, and you end up with a city where you have buildings from lots of different time periods with lots of different materials and scale, and it's totally chaotic, which a lot of urban planners might argue is a disaster. They'd rather have Paris where every building is the same height and the same color. But on the other hand, it fits with the character of the place, which is very much a more ad hoc, whatever works for that. And I think it's a more flexible system. Whether it can be sustained as a city in the future, I'm not sure, because I think there does have to be a better plan. If you're starting to talk about these kinds of buildings, the city really has to work together. The transport has to work, and all sorts of other functions. So it's maybe not a very definitive answer, but I don't see how you're ever going to get everybody to agree what that procedure ought to be, because they've all got their own territory, and I think it would only work if the government at the very top said, we will take another path, and I'm not sure they have the power to do that. So.
Just on that, I agree. In London, it's very unlikely. I think we'd move to a position like Paris, or with a very centralised decision-making process. The danger is that you can go to a sort of lowest common denominator, sort of, let's do something that will somehow not cause much trouble within that negotiated system. And there is a worry that one might end up with a series of fairly untesting projects. What seems to be interesting about Bishopsgate is that you pushed both a different form and a different skin condition quite a long way. And so far you seem to be getting a reasonably positive response. It'll be interesting to see how when that hits the real crunch of planning permission, whether that...
I have to give credit to the City of London really as well, because it's partly due to the protracted planning process where there are so many bodies involved, and you have to go back and forth between them and demonstrate to them that you have incorporated their concerns. it gives us time to make those improvements, in contrast to a building in North America or in Asia where there simply isn't the time. We might work on a concept design for 3 months. Well, here we've had 3 years, so that's really a major difference. And the other factor is that actually in London the budgets for buildings are fairly high compared to anywhere else in the world. And even I read yesterday in the Herald Tribune, I think, that New York is afraid of losing out to London because London is now rated as the best place to work because of the quality of the buildings, as well as the, despite the expensive place to live. There's just really very good quality buildings all across the city. So I think if there's any moment in time where these buildings could be built and achieve something, it's now. Maybe in 10 years the moment will be gone. So I think, well, let's hope they do get built. I think